Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and the fit for this video is the Batman. Let's take a look and see if needgod.net has debunked another biblical contradiction.
Number 5. No one has ever seen God, but Jacob saw God.
All right, let's see it.
In John 1:18 it says no one has ever seen God. But in Genesis we see Jacob wrestled with God, and afterward Jacob said, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. This is not a contradiction because they are talking about seeing God in two different senses. For example, if someone said, I've never spoken at school assembly before, a teacher might say, I've seen you whisper to your friend during school assembly before. But what the person meant was speaking in front of the school assembly, addressing all the students. They've never done that before. And so when John says no one has ever seen God, he simply means in terms of seeing God in the fullness of his glory, since God dwells in unapproachable light. What Jacob saw was simply God dwelling temporarily in a human body. He didn't see God in his fullness. So once again, no contradiction.
So two things to say here. The first is that this argument has a catastrophic flaw, namely that it is just flagrantly begging the question, because it is arguing against a contradiction in the Bible. It is arguing that the Bible has no contradictions. It is arguing for univocality, the idea that every last syllable of the Bible all speaks with one single unified and consistent voice and from one single unified and consistent perspective. But this argument requires we already presuppose univocality, because it is demanding that we understand the author of John and the author of Genesis to already agree in all things regarding God's nature, God's visibility, and how we talk about God's visibility. Because this creator is claiming that the author of Genesis is referring not to seeing God in their fullness, but to seeing a temporary manifestation of God not in their fullness. And so it means they have to understand that there is a temporary manifestation of God not in their fullness, and also another manifestation of God that would be in their fullness, which that author understands no one can ever see. Exactly the same as the understanding of the author of the Gospel of John. And so this argument requires that we accept the conclusion as part of the premise. And that's called begging the question. And this brings up the second thing to say, which is that the conceptualization of God's nature and visibility changed significantly between the composition of the Hebrew Bible and the composition of the New Testament. And the main factor in that change is Greek philosophy, and particularly Platonic Greek philosophy, and its notion that the divine exists spiritually and is not accessible to our senses. And John is adopting a kind of philonic notion of the Word as an emanation from God that allows the divine to bridge the gap between the unchanging eternal spirit and the changing and corrupt flesh. And so the only way to access deity on the part of the flesh would be through the Word. In other words, when John says no one has seen God, John is reflecting a Greco-Roman Jewish philosophical notion of God's invisibility. When Genesis says Jacob saw God face to face, when Exodus says the 70 elders of Israel saw God, when Exodus says that Moses saw God, when Numbers says that Moses talked with God face to face as a man talks with his friend, they do not have in mind this much later Greek philosophical notion of God as invisible. What they have in mind is a corporeal, anthropomorphic, male-presenting deity who is dangerous to look at because of how shiny they are. See, the idea of glory in the Bible is very similar to the Mesopotamian notion of melamu, that divine things and agents are clothed in a brilliance, a radiance that signals their deadliness or itself can be deadly. That's what's reflected in Exodus 33:20, where God covers Moses' face with their hand and says, you're only going to see my back because no one can see my face and live. Because it's too brilliant, it will kill you. But the interesting thing in the Hebrew Bible is that we have exceptions to this rule. We have multiple people who see God and are either terrified that it's going to kill them or are shocked that they have seen God and lived. And these are exceptions to the rule. This is not seeing some kind of partial temporary manifestation of God. There's no such concept represented anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. This is seeing God, but being saved from death. By the time of the Gospel of John, the notion of God's visibility and God's nature is beginning to change. Now, John is one of the more philosophically oriented authors in the New Testament, but by the time of the 3rd or the 4th century CE, pretty much all Christians had accepted that God was incorporeal and invisible, rather than corporeal, anthropomorphic, but hard to look at. And if you want literature on this, there are numerous books that talk about the anthropomorphism, the corporeality, the visibility of God in the Bible, even in the New Testament, among those less philosophically oriented authors. And I even, in my own book, Adonai's Divine Images, A Cognitive Approach, talk about why God was conceptualized this way and how it changed over time.
These are the 5 most common contradictions people bring up in the Bible, and as we've seen, not a single one of them is a valid contradiction. In fact, I've gone through lists of hundreds of so-called contradictions that atheists or Muslims bring up, and I can tell you that not a single one is actually a valid contradiction. The Bible once again stands up to scrutiny flawlessly.
So as I've shown across these 5 responses, this creator's grasp of the texts and the issues is weak. Their argumentation is weak as well as frequently fallacious. But that's okay for this creator, because the intended audience is not folks like me who have a good grasp of these issues or of how arguments work. The intended audience is folks who want to believe and just need the tiniest little sliver of not impossible to latch onto so that they can continue to believe. And as long as you can present your argument, no matter how fallacious, no matter how uninformed, in a confident sounding way, and you can make it sound possible to your audience, you've achieved your goal. And that's why there's so many of these kinds of videos, and that's why they always sound so confident, and that's why they never have the foggiest idea what they're talking about.